All right, this is a shorter supplement tape to the first tape that I just did, the first video. You'll probably hear a cicada right outside of my window here shortly. He's been going off and on while I've been trying to work on these tapes. But what we're going to be talking about here briefly is what is often referred to as the natural history of a social problem. Now, the way your textbook talks about this, it presumes a more modern environment with mass media, okay? So essentially, it's talking about maybe the last 300 years. It's really been only in the last 300 years or so that the West in particular, and maybe some other parts of the planet, have had mass media to one degree or another that has permitted the emergence of more rapid social movements. There are social movements that occur in pre-modern times, pre-industrial times, and they have some of these features that we'll be looking at, but not all, and usually they take longer to happen. And I'll give you a couple of examples. But in any case, the natural history of a social problem is usually given, and you see it in the news cycle, so this shouldn't be difficult for you to understand, that first you have the emergence of a group of people who, maybe even one person, who are making claims about what a social problem is. This happens all the time, especially in social media. This happens all the time. People claim that there is a social problem that they want you to pay attention to. And depending on what the public does, some people will be ignored. Some social problems will be, claims for social problems will be laughed at. It really depends on what the social problem is and whether it can gain traction, as we say. And of course, in our world, social media, especially in the last 20 years, social media has been used to try to generate the idea of social problems in a way that hasn't happened before. One of the things I'd really like to point out to you is that, if you're in your late teens, if you're, 18, 19, 20 years old, these social media platforms that you're so accustomed to are only as old as you are. So, and actually some are even younger. 20 years ago, Facebook didn't exist. So, some of what we've become accustomed to, it is very recent in terms of like Twitter, for example, or some of the other kinds of social media that's used. But in any case, even in the past, before this technology existed, if somebody wanted to make a claim that there was a social problem that needed to be addressed, it had to be announced in some way and a claim made about it. And then after that, of course, it has to establish some legitimacy. And part of that legitimacy comes with the group or the individual making the claim that there's a social problem in finding community with that social problem, because they have to convince a larger public that there is a social problem. So if a community succeeds in making something a social problem, then there can be a movement about it. And then, of course, at some point, the entrenched powers that be are going to strike back, if you will. They're going to challenge the legitimacy of whatever social problem is being claimed. And then there may even be some attempts to try to control people's thoughts and feelings and actions in order to try to convince the larger public that a social problem doesn't really exist. But if it is a social problem that enough people feel exist, then they will continue their agitation about it over time. or even if the established powers that be made some concessions, they may not have been enough. And so there'll be further agitation for more. And so at some point, if there is in fact a social problem and enough people believe that there's enough agitation, at some point the vested powers that be generally have to acknowledge that in some way and come up with alternative strategies. And alternative strategies can be found on both sides, if you will, because at this point it's a negotiation for power. So, the vested interests may concede certain points or may change certain policies, or they may attack their political opponents in the population even more viciously, in which case those individuals or those groups that are in the population that are agitating, they have to change their strategies in order to remain effective and not have their concerns squelched by the powers that be. And this goes on for a little while until some kind of change is made. And what is interesting is that if you look over the course of human history, at some point change is made. And that does seem to be kind of the way things go ultimately. Either some change is made or the old order, such as it was, changes and passes away. It is a point of history that really intense tyrannies don't last, and that's because it takes a lot of energy to maintain them. It just does, and eventually even a tyrant will die. And so, whether or not his or her, usually his, progeny are as tyrannical as he is, it's very difficult to do. You see happening in North Korea, where you have a population in North Korea that has basically been cowed by an ongoing process of psychological and economic and political brutality. There's no other way to talk about it. And this has been going on now for about, I don't know, it's going on 4 generations now. It's pretty close. So you have multiple generations of people who have known nothing else. And at that point, it becomes very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen to that population when that political system breaks down, because it will eventually at some point, because all human things end at some point. If you go back in history, and the historical example that I like to give for this is the Reformation movement, which broke up the absolute power that the Roman Catholic Church had on most of Western Europe for, it was maybe 900 years. It was about 900 years or so, for those people who were Catholic. Took the Catholic Church a while to make Europe Catholic. But in any case, the Reformation is a really powerful event that is often said to have begun in 1517, when Martin Luther, a Roman Catholic monk, Augustinian monk, very conservative monk, kind of issued a summons. He wasn't looking for a revolution. He was just looking for some reform in the church, but what he got was a revolution. And it plunged Europe into literally 4 centuries of religious warfare. I mean, literally. And that warfare did not really end as such until the Napoleonic conflicts of the late 19th century. Anyway, that aside, a lot of people like to try to say that that's when the Reformation started, but in fact, the Reformation and the process about the Reformation had actually begun a couple of centuries earlier. And in fact, it had started in the early to mid 14th century, and there were 2 events that precipitated it. And one was something that was called the Schism of the Catholic Church. And essentially, for a period of about a generation, you had 2 popes, because there was a disagreement about who the Pope should be. And of course, I'm simplifying it massively there, but there were two popes. And that happened, and it caused a number of civil wars in different parts of Europe about who the Pope should be, mostly between France and Spain and Italy, but, it was important in Europe. And then there was the Black Death. And the Black Death fundamentally changed the way in which a lot of Europeans saw the church, because the church was completely ineffective against the Black Death, completely pointless. It could do nothing to stop the spread of the disease. And that completely changed the kind of experience of a lot of Europeans at the time. They began to lose faith with the church. And so there began to be various protest movements against the papacy throughout Europe. And by the end of the 14th century, there were a lot of them. So basically what you see happening is, in terms of emergence and claims making, you see different groups of people in Europe popping up and making claims about the Catholic Church and about what faith was about and about what the church was and about the meaning of life. And the way that the church responded to this was by instituting a number of inquisitions. That's where the Inquisition comes from. The church had failed with the Crusades. It had failed to destroy Islam in the Middle East, so it decided basically that it was going to take the fight to Europe. And so it started, wherever one of these protest movements would pop up, it would go after people and burn them at the stake and accuse them of being witches and accuse them of being all kinds of things. And eventually what ended up happening was a deep raft of resentment that had built up and built up and built up and built up, especially in Northern Europe, which was being heavily taxed by the papacy. The aristocrats, essentially, in Northern Europe, were being heavily taxed by the papacy, and they were pretty ticked off. And we don't want to have to even go into what happened to Henry VIII and his experience with the church and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, what really happened, of course, as we know, is when Martin Luther issued that challenge on the Wittenberg Cathedral with his 98 Theses, as it's called, what eventually occurred was he was questioning not the legitimacy of the church, but the legitimacy of some of the church's claims. And of course, the church had been threatening the legitimacy of all of these different movements that had been popping up. But people kept renewing the claims. So basically, when he did that, and because of the newly developed Western printing press, there had been printing presses before China actually invented the printing press. It wasn't Gutenberg. What Gutenberg did was he altered the printing press for European use and made it smaller and more portable, so it was more useful that way. But what happened, of course, was that printing press that he developed had just come into use, and so somebody ripped this notice that Martin Luther tacked up there onto the cathedral door, ripped it off and printed it up, and it went everywhere. And it was, so basically he just blew the lid off of a movement that was already there, and it just exploded. It just exploded. And eventually what ended up happening were a number of alternative strategies that the Catholic Church had to come up with. It took them almost 100 years to come up with it, but they had to finally eventually acknowledge that the church needed to be reformed, and they did actually do a pretty thorough reform. The Jesuit order actually came out of that reform. They did a pretty thorough reform and have reformed several times since. The various Protestant movements and the states that they were connected to. Originally, various Protestant movements were connected to different political orders in different European states. And so that changed the nature of those political states and gave rise to the different types of Protestantism that came to be, and that eventually came to the United States, that led to the proliferation of different types of churches, Christian churches that we have in the United States. So, but this took centuries. It took centuries to do, and a lot of conflict. So, like I said at the very beginning of this, when the Protestant Reformation first got started, and the lid blew off, it resulted in literally 400 years of religious warfare between various European powers. I mean, there were wars being fought for other reasons, but religion was always among those reasons. It was Catholics and Protestants. And of course, you see that most clearly in what happened in Ireland. But what happened in Ireland is also specific to what happened in Ireland, and had to do more with the British crown eventually, the English crown eventually becoming Protestant in and of itself. So, so this is the kind of thing that happens. Now, social problems emerge and are argued for much more quickly, and that's sort of an American thing too, much more quickly. And social media is a big part of that, the kind of social media that we have. And it's not clear whether that social media leads to real changes. We will still see, with the Me Too movement, for example, or the Black Lives Matter movement, or frankly, Trump's movement, if you want to consider MAGA to be a movement, which some people do consider it, certainly people that are in it consider it to be a movement. It's unclear how much social media will actually influence real changes. Certainly, it encourages people to develop alliances, if you will. But whether real changes will come out of that is another issue entirely. But this is what is often considered to be the life cycle, essentially, of a social problem. And there are real changes that happen, to be clear, real honest changes that happen with societies. The important thing to understand about social changes that come as a result of social issues being raised is that these are not necessarily progressive. Americans also have inherited this idea that we are progressing towards something better and better and better and better and better. And that isn't necessarily what we see happening with social problems emerging and then the conflicts and the changes that occur. Human society is more cyclical in some ways than it is progressive and linear, at least if you know world history. And although it would be nice if human beings would get better and better and better and conditions would get better and better and better, that we're still waiting to see whether that really happens over the long haul. So, but I wanted to introduce you to this natural history because it is something that we'll be talking about, especially when we talk about the media.